Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti and this is the 2023 Job Market series where I speak with young scholars entering the academic job market about their latest research on India. I spoke with Kartikeya Batra, who is a Ph.D. candidate in economics at the University of Maryland and has a master's in international affairs from the Fletcher School. His research lies at the intersection of political economy, development economics, and economic history. We discussed his job market paper titled Long-Run Effects of Land Redistribution, Evidence from India, and talked about the erstwhile zamindari or talukdari system and its impact on modern-day Uttar Pradesh, land titling versus land redistribution in India, the importance of property rights, the relationship between land-owning castes and socio-economic outcomes, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Hi Kartikeya, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi Shruti, it's a pleasure to be on the show and thanks for conducting this wonderful series.
I'm excited to get into your job market paper. And in your job market paper, what you are looking at are the long-run effects of reorganization of sort of proprietary rights and property rights in land in the early 19th century in what is modern-day Uttar Pradesh. But that time it was, a motley crew of provinces that were
United
strung
Provinces,
together.
yeah.
Eventually became United Provinces, yes.
Yeah.
And what you find is that the areas that moved away from the traditional Mughal and East India Company sort of zamindari system we are familiar with now, they actually shifted to a mahalwari system, which is typically at the village level, a lot more landlords as opposed to giant feudal estates is the way I would think about that. And the shift, small bit of it happens over the late 17th century and 18th century, but really between 1820 and 1860 is the period that you are studying. There's almost, now we're 200 years later. And what you find is that today, the areas that shifted towards the Mahalwari system compared to the erstwhile Mughal Zamindari system have higher wealth, higher non-farm employment, more years of schooling, essentially better economic outcomes and social outcomes in modern day areas of Uttar Pradesh that reformed themselves almost 200 years ago. So can you tell us how someone goes about studying this question and what exactly you're doing in this paper?
So before that, Shruti, that's actually a very wonderful summary. Talukdari system was a remnant of the Mughal system, and those talukdars were recognized as landowners in one part of Uttar Pradesh. In the rest of Uttar Pradesh, the East India Company took land which was earlier under the control of the talukdars and distributed land titles to local village communities. Now, understand in the Mughal period, the whole state is under talukdars, who are revenue collectors who owe their allegiance to the Nawab. Although they're just revenue farmers, but they are exercising a lot of de facto power in their areas. And they are stamping out proprietary rights of these village communities who've been living there for, God knows since when, right? When the British come in, they annex Uttar Pradesh in a staggered manner. So in large parts of Uttar Pradesh, 77%, if anybody here listening to this podcast is aware of the geography of Uttar Pradesh, what I'm talking about is Western UP, Southern UP, which is Bundelkhand, and Purvanchal, which is Eastern UP. Those parts are first taken over by the British during the early 1800s. And in the next 20-30 years, they introduced the Mahalwari system where, as you rightly said, 2-3 things are done. One, local village communities are identified who they think were the initial owners of land. They are given proprietary titles and they're also made liable for revenue payments. That's happened in the treated areas. So which is why this is redistribution in the sense that you took land from powerful revenue farmers, paid them off, and you redistributed land, on average, and redistributed amongst smaller village communities. You gave them titles. In the other area, which is the central part of UP, which is Awadh, annexation is held back until the 1850s for political reasons. In 1850s, when finally it's annexed, their initial plan is to actually implement the Mahalwari system even there, which is why this variation is sort of exogenous. But what happens is the mutiny of 1857, which is a national event. And now they want to ensure that they retain the loyalty of the talukdars who were very powerful, politically powerful in their areas. So in central UP, to be clear, the area around Lucknow, let's say, broadly, what they do is they say, okay, you talukdars, even you were a little not so loyal towards us during the revolt. So we're going to confer your lands, but wait, if you submit to us and you pledge your allegiance to us, we'll make you not just revenue farmers, we'll give you proprietary titles. So now you have a situation where land titling has happened in both areas within UP, but in one area it's happened amongst a number of people, smaller village communities, whereas in the other area the previous de facto system is made de jure in a way, or the old system is continued to function with new proprietary titles, with the talukdars retaining their political powers now as landowners. So that is the basic structure. Now, how I got motivated by this question was honestly, Shruti, I was just thinking, why is UP the way it is? And I just went on this journey 2 years back to figure out what can be done to figure out why, because I do a lot of election analysis. So this was also the time in the lead up to the UP elections. And when I was studying the politics and economy of UP, I realized it's so different in different parts. It's like studying five different European countries packed into one, right? And so, of course, there are several complex factors that go into the long run evolution of socioeconomic outcomes. One of the factors I zeroed in was this, the land tenure system or the land ownership system. So that was the motivation. And then I just told you the setup of the policy experiment. Within UP, the two areas were separated by a boundary, which I, in my paper, have tried to convince the readers was arbitrary, which then allows us for a spatial RD methodology. And then I then aggregate village level data from three different data sources, three different village level data sources. And as you said, we get asset data from population census, we get years of schooling from the SECC, and we get non-farm employment from the economic census. This is all from 2011 to 2013. So then I run a spatial RD. UP has around more than 100,000 villages. My sample is limited to 10,000 villages around that border. And so, as you rightly said, I find long run positive effects of that land redistribution in the long run. Interestingly, the literature on land redistribution, although theoretically is pretty robust, empirically well identified papers are not that many. And one of the problems is this only, that there's endogeneity in policy implementation. Like which state does it? Usually it's done at a state level or a national level. So you can either do cross-state comparison or cross-country comparisons. So then that way, this policy experiment, which by the way has also been used in a previous paper by Priyanka Pandey in a different context, 2010, is different because it's intrastate, so it takes care of a lot of factors that probably interstate comparisons don't take into account or can't take into account. So that's the basic premise of the paper.
And what is it that you think is driving this result, right? That the modern day outcomes are now linked to something that happened in the past, but what is the mechanism through which this is transmitted?
Exactly. So, of course, as I said, land redistribution is like one shock, which then sets several balls rolling, right? It's almost impossible to tease out all potential mechanisms. But the mechanism that I went through was caste. Again, this is all because of my interest in electoral analysis. And if you're analyzing elections in any Indian state, you have to figure out what the caste equations are. So one thing that one has to understand is how inextricably linked land ownership and the caste system have been over the centuries. Essentially, they mutually reinforce each other. You are upper caste, so you'll own land. You own land, therefore you are in a power position. Right? So, as I said, there could have been several channels of persistence, but the one that I chose to focus was caste, right? So one other result, which I think is new in this paper, which has not been seen in the two broad strands of literature I'm contributing to. One is land redistribution. Maybe a little bit there, but not so much, at least in the Indian context. And second is the literature on historical colonial institutions in India. So you have papers by Abhijit Banerjee, Lakshmi Iyer. Lakshmi Iyer herself has done some work on princely states. This Priyanka Pandey's work. And then in the Indian context, land redistribution work mostly has been done by Pranab Bardhan and Dilip Mukherjee. This is paper by Besley and co-authors, including Rohini Pandey. They talk a little bit about it, but here what I'm also figuring out is, okay, so we had this land redistribution. done. So we have long run persistent effects. But we have to understand that even back then, land was only redistributed amongst the upper caste households. In both the treated and control areas, land was held only by upper caste households. When I say only, I mean roughly 70 to 80%. Which means that redistribution amongst the scheduled castes was almost next to nil. And I went through colonial gazettes to actually identify. I find no data where it says some OBCs did get some land when redistribution took place. But there's virtually no record of any land being redistributed among SCs. So you use caste as a proxy for any household which was there back in the day, which was a non-beneficiary. And you find that in the long run, even the SCs who may not have received land back then have benefited. Now, what might explain that? They did not receive land. So there can't be direct effects of wealth ownership. There has to be something else that's happening, right? And again, land redistribution is such a complex subject, there could be several things happening. One, for instance, is just the local economy changes, right? Wages go up, credit constraints go down because somebody in your neighborhood owns land, they set up an industry or something. Or the second is, broadly speaking, that land redistribution somehow changes institutional factors in your area. So does that impact the politics of your area? Does that impact the sociology of your area? So that's where then I focus. My hypothesis was, and I did a field survey for this, that, imagine that you used to living in an area where you had a bunch of feudal lords, very few. By the way, between control and treatment, the number of landowners, upper caste landowners by the 1940s, the ratio was 1:3. So 17 landlords per 1,000 people in the control areas versus 49 in treated areas. Now, so this shock to the land system happened because of the reform, right? Imagine you living in the treated areas. You were like the control area for a very long time, right? And you were used to the 17 landlords per 1,000 people theory that, there's one landlord who's huge, feudal talukdar, and, that person is godly in nature and I have to submit to them. Suddenly this land system is shocked. And now you don't have one, but on average, 3 landowners around you. Of course, their landowning size also goes down. Of course, their political power also goes down. So does that in any way impact your compliance with social norms? This is coming from a scheduled caste perspective, that scheduled caste households are told, or they are conditioned, that you can't study beyond a point, you have to do this work, your child cannot do this job, etc. So once the higher echelons of that system start shaking or their power gets reduced, now you have more outside options, there is more competition amongst them, etc., etc. Does that in any way affect your compliance with these restrictive norms, which may have been holding you back socioeconomically? So in my field survey, I compiled a bunch of questions from different surveys, World Value Survey, Alicina, etc., sort of tailored them to the Indian reality of the caste system. And I asked them questions that, how much do you agree with the following? That if there is a government job, it should be reserved for the upper caste, for example, first, or something like that. There's a bunch of, and then compile an index of it. I also asked them, what do you think your grandson or son should become when they grow up? Also asked them, do you agree with the current functioning of the caste system? And Shruti, we found that in the treated areas, the support for the existing caste system was lower, and aspirational mobility or aspirations and the desire for mobility was higher. Compliance with these norms was lower. So my limited point here is that I think there could have been a bunch of complex mechanisms at play. But one of the mechanisms at play, it seems, was that immediately after you redistributed land, there was a change in norms because the powers that be in the treated areas, their number went up, their influence per individual went down or per household went down. And so the folks who you were used to following them probably felt something. And that led to a change in social norms amongst them. I think I can preempt your next question, but I'll let you ask it because a lot of people ask me, oh, but how can you say norms changed first and then socioeconomic indicators changed? It's possible that,
Yeah, my question's not so much about norms, actually. My question, I want to go back to history for a minute. My question is more about the way you characterize what happened in UP in the 1820s, right? So the way I think about property rights and proprietary rights in India, especially as they were set up by the East India Company, it of course starts in the 1760s to 1790s in the Diwani of Bengal. And there, India has never had the Anglo-Saxon system of property rights, right? They were trying to import it, but to import it, they would have had to do like serious cadastral surveys, have proper titling, the way they did in the South. Now I'm thinking like what Monroe did in the South, for instance, almost 50, 60 years later. But they don't have the state capacity to do it in East India Company, of the Diwani of Bengal. So what they do is they just transfer the entire system to the existing Mughal zamindari system. And the zamindars who were just very powerful, but still just revenue collectors, actually become property owners. And the right to buy and sell the zamindari becomes de facto the right to buy and sell the land associated with it. And overnight, all the original property owners get converted into tenants, right? Where now the zamindar is the landlord and the East India Company is kind of a super landlord mixed in with a sovereign of some sort. Now, there's a little bit of this permanent settlement in the Jaunpur side, but leaving that aside, when we come to Uttar Pradesh, my major question on your sort of historical research design is, it seems to me that this is not really act of redistribution, right? It seems to me that places that actually had a sensible village group council system, they decide to actually title that and recognize that instead of imposing some crazy thing like, what permanent settlement did almost 50, 60 years ago. So in a sense, they're learning from their mistakes and they are reassigning or titling in a uniform way the property customs that already existed there.
They did a survey in UP as well.
No, I'm sure they did. So to me, the way the British acted in the early part of the rule, which is the East India Company rule, is places where they had the capacity to actually enforce the rules and understand the rules and then collect revenue directly are quite different from the places where they didn't have the capacity to do so. So now this is where my question of indigeneity, finally I'm getting to it, which is there something unique about Audh, as they call it, or Awadh in the Indian parlance? Is there something fundamentally different about Awadh where it is just so difficult to develop state capacity in that area for various historical reasons, for the mutiny and other things? That's the reason it ends up going to the talukdars. And in other places where you say it was actually redistributed from talukdars, to the farmer, I don't think that's exactly a redistribution. In fact, it is a non-distribution. Because in other places, what East India Company effectively did was it took away the rights of the cultivator and instead made it a proprietary right for talukdars and zamindars and so on. So I guess that's my question. Would you characterize this as a redistribution? And, if not, then do you suddenly face an indigeneity problem with the research design?
As I think I mentioned this in passing in my earlier response, that if not for the mutiny, Audh would have also faced a similar scenario. They were ready to do something very similar in Audh. So if you had Monroe in South, the champion of this system in UP was Holt McKenzie. So he came up with this, there was this whole speech or letter, whatever you may call it. And he said, we need to do this. Okay. In 1822. So they were ready to do this in Audh, but the mutiny happened. Which is why you can say that there was nothing special about Audh, except for the fact that the timing probably went awry for them. If Audh had been annexed, say, 10, 15 years before 1856, probably the same system would have been implemented. Now, to the point of use of whether this is redistribution or not, so how would we generalize it in today's framework, right? You are the government and you find that a bunch of people have taken over land or control of land which used to belong to some other community. And that's happened in a pretty big area, right? So as a power, as a dictatorial power almost, you step in, you take control of those lands first, away from these guys who are controlling the land. And then you say, okay, let's figure out who are the people who used to live here earlier. We'll do a survey. We'll check exactly what happened. Of course, it wasn't perfect, it was limited capacity, but it was there. And then whoever we think used to own this plot of land or had property rights before these Mughal invaders came in, we are going to assign them rights. So therefore, we're going to create smaller pattas, as you would call them in India, patta being a land title, right? To my mind, this is different from a classic land redistribution sort of policy where you have a land ceiling and the excess land is redistributed amongst, landless people. No, this is different. Of course, it's very different. In fact, it's sort of closer to what happens in, say, Colombia. For like, there's public land, and the government just says, okay, I'm going to redistribute this land. Except that in this case, the government does expropriate land and says, this is probably in this transitionary phase, it's my land. But by the way, it used to belong to someone. Let's identify who those people are. And then those people, when they take control over their pieces of land, they practice their own agricultural methods. Some communities are the ones who own and cultivate. Some are the ones who own but don't cultivate, so they hire other laborers. So I would still say that titling happened in both places, but the distribution of land amongst people whose rights had been taken or in customary takes place only in the treated areas, not in the control area.
Fair enough. I just don't think of it as traditional land reform. I just think of it as recognition of property rights as opposed to derecognition, which they do in other places.
Of course, titling happened in both areas. So you can make the argument that, okay, Talukdar's titling was more like as a derecognition or de-distribution, whereas that in the case of the treated areas is more like you're giving it back to those. So I think you may define it whichever way. There are 2-3 ways of defining it. But at the end, the first order effect.
Yeah, is that there is a lot less concentration of land in the hands of the few.
Yeah.
No, I totally understand that. The reason I was getting into the land reform question is because that clearly sets your project apart from what happens in the post-colonial papers, which are studying the same question. Because that land reform and land redistribution is of a completely different category.
Nature, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Than what you are fundamentally talking about. But it feels similar because in both cases we're talking about reducing concentration of land in the hands of the few and so on. But we don't want conflation on these things, right? So that's the reason for nitpicking.
That's absolutely perfect. I agree with that. In fact, I'm working on this section, Contribution to Literature, and these are the questions staring me in the face. But one thing is that this policy is also different in the following way. That post-independence, a lot of policies happened under a democratic setup. So there was only so much the government could do in terms of expropriation, right? So even if you read work by Bardhan and Mukherjee, for instance, they make the point that in Bengal, where land ceiling was implemented, redistribution was probably not very effective because poor quality land was redistributed. When you have a colonial project like this, it is so absolute in nature that probably some of those frictions that are a result of a democratic institution, which I'm all for, are not there. So
Fair enough.
That sense, that you're absolutely right. The policy is different.
The kind of uniformity that they were able to impose is quite different. No, I completely understand.
And the scope for probably fudging also or manipulation of the policy by the landowners probably also was not as high. But of course.
So a second question now, and here I want to kind of dig into the difference between the Mahalwari areas and the Talukdari areas. So this is the difference between the controlled and the treated areas. So in the Mahalwari areas, one of the things that's going on is there is a collective action problem, so to speak, has already been solved by the community, right? So the community has already got the resources where they're able to figure out who is cultivating what, who owns what. They're able to sort out the low-level disputes that can occur on, when it comes to a farming community or a village community. And they're able to figure out the revenue collection system, right? In a way, that's the reason it is decentralized. Once again, places where that could be done automatically since the very beginning, where the Mughal talukdars may not have had as much power to begin with, I imagine, which is why this system was working reasonably well. Does that pose a indigeneity problem again for what you're trying to study? Because it's quite clear that in Awadh, something was going on where it was just much harder for both the Avdi cultivator and the, company and crown rule to sort of overthrow this union or cartel of talukdars. They were just really hard to get rid of. So once again, is there something different in these two bottom-up approaches, even in minor regional differences? Because Uttar Pradesh as a state is only our modern-day imagination. So I guess what I'm asking is Western UP more like Punjab than it is like Eastern UP, and we've just characterized it and bundled it all in one place together? Or, for instance, is Western UP fundamentally different because it was closer to Delhi? We know now that places that were farther removed from Delhi, the talukdars and zamindars had a much higher degree of power because, that's how the Mughals delegated power, right? So places that were closer to Delhi, they didn't have to delegate as much. They could have a lot more oversight. So do you think some of this stuff is going on here?
So the first empirical answer is that it's a spatial RD within a very narrow bandwidth. So around the border, that's the idea behind an RD, that 10 kilometers here and 10 kilometers there. It shouldn't be that different. Second, I'm controlling for distance to 4 important historical cities in UP in my main specification: Kanpur, Lucknow, Agra, and Allahabad. 3 because they have been capitals, and 1 because of an important commercial center. They're mostly for precision. Even if I remove those controls, things don't change a lot. Third thing is that, and thank you for giving me an avenue to show off a little bit. I compiled data from N.A. Akbari, which is probably the only pre-colonial record that colonial gazettes cite. And I was able to link colonial tehsils to modern tehsils, and then colonial tehsils to the pre-colonial Mughal tehsils. The latter was a little easier because the gazettes had the mapping for me. And I controlled for 4 or 5 different factors which were present in N.A. Akbari. One was tax demands. Second was presence of infantry, cavalry, and there was something called religious donations. When I control for those factors, assume that they are pre-treatment and there is some imbalance and they're impacting the long run outcome, then that should change the coefficients. That doesn't happen. So even after controlling for those pre-colonial factors, the results remain robust. Of course, the pre-colonial factor data is available at the sub-district level. So it's not a perfect measure, but it's the best we got. Also, Shruti, what I was able to document using some data from a paper by Dave Donaldson was that actually initially after the Meherwari system was implemented, they were doing not as well as one might think. Their initial performance from the period of 1880s to 1930, for which I have data, just compared to just a basic means comparison of the bordering districts around this border, actually Meherwari areas and treated areas were doing badly, if at all. So something happened later. One of the reasons was that once you gave land titles to these communities, a lot of people started dividing land. They said, okay, give me my piece, I'm leaving, bye. This ties into modern literature by, again, Vardhan Mukherjee, this other paper in 2010, where they show how land redistribution leads to further distribution and it leads to migration, etc. So, Awadh, I would still say, Shruti, to whatever I have understood, of course, we're all learning even after the paper is published, right? From what I have understood is that the boundary takes care of a lot of the factors that you just mentioned, but in general, I don't find any reason why Awadh was very different from, at least within that bandwidth, but in general also. Because as I said, if not for the mutiny, which was a national event, Awadh would have faced the same fate as the rest of the state. Plus, this is also the period when the East India Company is waning and the crown is rising in India. So the ideologies are also different. The East India Company was being seen from my literature as too much of a social player, that you are interfering in traditions and practices in India. Why are you doing all this? The crown wants more status quoist approach.
Yeah, they want stability.
Exactly, because they are a more political animal, whereas the East India Company is more of a venture that has turned into a political creature, right? Again, there is no perfect answer, but in the paper, I have tried my best to convey that these factors should be more. And then the last thing I've also done is I used this World Atlas from 1914, and I've shown that at least within the bandwidth, if you start from 2nd century BC until the 1850s, you will find that both the treatment controlled areas are probably falling in the same kingdom, except for one period in time, which is I think 1398, when the southern boundary of this boundary that I am exploiting collides with, or sort of, it is the same as the southern boundary of a kingdom called the Jaunpur kingdom. So as a robustness check, I remove that boundary and I re-estimate my results so they don't change. That boundary is also important because it's the boundary of the Ganga flows. So removing that serves two purposes. It's robustness to exclusion of the river as well as the southern boundary of the Jaunpur kingdom.
So, can we, just as an aside, this is not crucial to your paper, can we just talk for a minute about what was happening in Jaunpur? Because that happened well before 1820. And that's sort of more of the permanent settlement of the Bengal Diwani system than it is of what's happening in 1820s, in Uttar Pradesh or in the south and so on. So what's going on in Jaunpur?
There's a treaty of 1775, I think that you're referring to, in Banaras, right? Where the British, and this is probably their first steps into UP. And they come in and, they take over again. So I'm not 100% clear about this, but what happens eventually is it is touted as a zamindari, but de facto it is also mehelwai. So it's the Treaty of Banaras. And again, just so that I'm not conflating results, in my robustness checks, I remove that part of the boundary so that just in case that's driving the results, which it's not, thankfully. So that part of the state had been settled back in 1775 only. That's a very small portion though. Majority of annexation happens between 1801 and 1803. Parts are annexed and my treated control area, the way it's done, again, that's another reason why indigeneity may not be that big of a concern. So the British are trying to squeeze the Nawab of Awadh, right? And they are increasing his tax payments. There comes a point when he's unable to pay them, and the British pretty well know this. And then they say, okay, you can't pay tax. Why don't you cede some land to us? So he says, okay, you know what? Take some land along the periphery of my kingdom, right? And the Treaty of Awadh is signed in 1801. In my paper, I show a snapshot of it. And so in that treaty, what happens is areas outside the border, which I'm exploiting, they somehow give parts of it to the British. And when you look at the Treaty of Awadh, it's not very clear how they're doing it. It's very random, like some complete districts are going, some small blocks are going. So anyway, so the way that is finally determined is that the Nawab owes the company a few crores or something, some money. So he says, you take land which is worth that much. So this is again just telling you that at the end of it, this was all not very systematic in nature. It's just that the Nawab wanted to retain his central piece of the kingdom, which is very natural. But he said, you just take like a belt of the land which is on the periphery of my kingdom, whose value amounts to the revenue that I owe you.
Yeah. So coming back to the underlying mechanism that you're exploring, I just wanted to place it more broadly in the literature. So your mechanism is fundamentally one of concentration of assets, specifically in land, and concentration of assets in particular castes, right, within a social structure. Now, like Alexander Lee's paper, for instance, talks about the difference between systems and therefore the long-run outcomes as a function of state capacity, right? Because what he's looking at is zamindari versus riyotwari, or, British provinces versus, the princely states. And what you find is that in systems that are not zamindari or talukdari, where the British is more directly involved in revenue collection. Now, if you have a revenue collection system that you need, then you're going to have officers placed there, which means you're going to have some kind of district collector office or sub-district office, which is also going to do a whole bunch of other things. And that's how state capacity gets developed. And that's the general story there. Why is that not potentially the story in the area that you're studying?
Yeah. As I said, there could be, Shruti, honestly, there could be dozens of mechanisms here. As I said, it's very complex, right? It's been 200 years. What one can do somebody in my shoes can do probably is to focus on one or two and then rule out a couple of others, right? What I do on state capacity, and I read this Lee paper back in 2021, what I do in this paper is I test for state capacity using two different metrics, and I compile this from the gazettes. So one was more straightforward than the other. One was just looking at tax demands per acre at the sub-district level. So I compile that and I find that it's balanced between the two areas. So the tax collection is not different. So one would assume that spending would also be the same. How would we do that? So colonial gazettes are a treasure trove of a lot of information. and colonial gazettes from the 1900s, 1901, 1905 at the district level, they contain data on the list of schools with locality name. A locality could be a village or a town or a city. So what I did over the summer very painstakingly was manually map around 2,500 localities to modern day villages. And I think I have got an 85% match rate for now. And I find balance on that as well. The probability of receiving a school by the early 1900s, mind you, there is a 30-40 period when the treated areas are under the British and Awadh is under the Nawab. So there's there. But 40 years after the annexation of Awadh, it seems that if there was any difference, there was catch up. Catch up was completed. Because statistically, there is no difference between the probability of receiving a school within the bandwidth. Again, to be very clear, using the archival records that I have been able to collect. So, state capacity is definitely a potential factor, but it seems that in my case,
that's not the driving factor.
It's not a very important factor. And again, one of the things that differentiates this paper from, say, Alexander Lee's paper or broadly Abhijit Banerjee Lakshmi's paper is also that those papers take a very national view, macro view, which also sort of constrains their ability to implement very robust empirical strategies. And I think they admit to it. I'm not saying it myself. The trade-off here is this paper's empirical strategy is better, but of course the generalizability is lower because
it's extremely regional.
Exactly. So it's very localized. And so that's the trade-off. So probably what Lee finds may still be valid, but at a more nationally aggregated level.
It's not the driving force in this region,
exactly.
Especially in the border areas. Yeah. So, can you walk me through the size of these effects? Like, I mean, what are we really talking about here? What is the big difference between, the birth accident of being born on this side of the Awadh?
Right. So there are three variables that you initially mentioned, right? One is asset ownership, which is basically an aggregate index that I create. Then one is average years of schooling. And then there is non-farm employment per 100 people. And there are three very different indicators indicating different things. Like household wealth is more assets. Human capital formation is years of schooling. And you can think of non-farm employment as an indicator of structural transformation in an area, moving away from agriculture to manufacture to industry. Okay. So in schooling and asset ownership, the average treatment effect is 6 to 7% of the control mean. I mean, 200 years later, there's still a 6 to 7% effect, despite all the redistribution policies and affirmative action, etc. On non-farm employment, it's 50% of the control mean. So that's huge, right? And just to give you perspective, right? And I'll have
so basically, they hastened the structural transformation by setting something in place 200 years ago.
Exactly. And, again, there could be so many things happening. But then when we come down to scheduled castes, the magnitudes actually go up further in terms of percentages. So, these effects are sizable even for a normal, I would say, treatment. But to think of it as something that happened 200 years back, I think it's fairly robust. I mean, in the sense that it's something you can't ignore.
No, but absolutely not. If we had a policy intervention which gave you these effects, you'd be like, yeah, do it. I mean, anything it takes to get these things done, right? So these effects are pretty large. I mean, it's very difficult to think of modern day policy implications based on sort of this kind of historical work. But is there any modern day policy implication that you can think of other than the fact that the state should really have very sensible sort of, land titling, sensible understanding of rights and, have a systematization in some sense of what's happening in different sectors of the economy?
I'll take a different route to this answer, okay? Because there are some results I haven't discussed with you. And I think a policy implication, if any, might just come from there. Because I think we are past the point of land redistribution policies, programs, at least in India at this point, honestly speaking. But there is an important lesson to be learned, which is the following. So in the survey, we also caught some other things, right? I told you so far the story is in treated areas, the scheduled caste households are more aspirational, they are more mobile, intergenerational. Right? What does that do to their relationships with the upper caste households, right? So one of the things that I went to the field with was, I thought that, Guys in the control areas would be fed up of the upper caste households. They'll be like, "You've spoiled our lives, it's blah blah blah. So we don't like you anymore." I played an ultimatum game with them. So what we did was we gave them unfair offers. We randomized the caste of the proposers. So a list was read out to them.
And what's the offer for?
It's like saying that, we gave them 40 rupees and they have sent you this offer. We are splitting this money.
Okay, it's the ultimatum splitting game.
Exactly, ultimatum game, right? And so, like, I can share the list with you. There was a Rajput, Brahman, there was a Yadav. So there were OBCs, SCs, upper caste, all three. And for placebos, we had some Sikhs names. Okay. So, to the contrary, what we found was that actually in the control areas, the level of cooperation or acceptance of unfair offers is higher amongst the lower caste households. So in a way, there is more social capital or trust or cooperation, whatever you may want to call it, in the control areas.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that the aspirations have been stifled generationally or intergenerationally.
I'm coming to that exactly. Yeah. That's exactly the point. The other thing we found was there is less cooperation in treated areas between the upper caste and scheduled caste on things like sharing water from the same well. What explains that, Shruti? There is a model by Acemoglu and Robinson, and what you just said is perfect. That when you are in a position of power such that your sphere of influence is so big, you adopt different strategies to block changes to things like social norms. It seems like in the control areas, because you did not redistribute too much of land, the powerful Bahubalis, as you call them in UP, most of them come from that area. If you've heard of Raja Bhaiya, Brij Bhushan Sharan Singh, these are all Bahubali or powerful muscular leaders. Not in a good way, of course. They all come from that area. Anecdotally, that makes sense, right? Now, if you put it empirically and then theoretically, the way this works is because they have so much to begin with, they have all the incentives to be strategic about their behavior towards the lower caste households. On the other side, the treated areas, you anyway shrunk the land size, you've shrunk their power, they don't have much to save. So they become more spiteful towards the lower caste households because the socioeconomic gap reduces. So the policy implication that I took was that at the end, we are trading growth for social harmony in a society like Uttar Pradesh, which is so socially split or fragmented along caste lines. That are the welfare effects positive, net, negative, or zero? We don't know. So any policy that seeks to take something away from the elite and redistribute it, what sort of a role do the elite play in that policy formulation is probably something that this paper throws up as a question at the end. Because you have now generated two different sets of incentives for the upper caste households to behave with the lower caste households. And whereas the lower caste households seem to be doing much better in the treated area socioeconomically, but it's not as cordial. In the control areas, there is cordiality, but it's a very perverse cordiality. Because that cordiality is, as you rightly said, is allowing the upper caste to stifle the lower caste. And this ties into another paper by Acemoglu and co-authors on Sierra Leone, where they found that paramount chiefs, who were the erstwhile sort of power centers in Sierra Leone, they use higher social cooperation and capital to make sure that they retain informal control over people. In India, Sivan Anderson and co-authors find in Maharashtra that the Maratha landlords, so in democratic societies, the old power centers find new ways of retaining informal control. So in Maharashtra, the Maratha landlords have resorted to something called clientelistic vote trading. So they want to retain that sense of power. So what they do in order to achieve that, they will not indulge in violence. They will not arm twist you. They'll just strike a deal with you as voters. In Sierra Leone, they will indulge in higher social cooperation. Something similar is happening in the control areas here. And I'll just end by saying that at the end, I also see that if you look at political candidate selection, upper caste households are more likely to get nominated in the control areas and treated areas, probably because of their influence in these areas.
No, this is really fascinating. And I understand that these are not like exactly policy implications, but they're more like social implications or just a better understanding of what is going on in these places other than just the measurement of how much land is owned or, how many people own a radio or a TV and, so on. This is really fascinating. And I really enjoyed reading the paper. Thank you so much for doing this. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Shruti. I really appreciate it. And it's been fun to speak one's mind out. At times, the right answers come when the right questions are asked. So thank you for asking that wonderful question.
No, thrilled to have you here. Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.